Good morning and welcome, friends. Our meetings on Sundays is at 11 a.m. and there's a specific topic discussed which is presented by a student of Theosophy. This week's presentation is on why study Theosophy. The movement that made a tremendous and external effort for the 19th century for bringing the information necessary for future generations to enlighten the mind and give the heart a propulsion towards compassion is still available to the students of Theosophy today. The study of the books and understanding of the material in them is necessary for each human soul, because in the evolutionary process, buddhi manas is the goal for the change for the century. And without studying and understanding and its application to daily life, we really do not benefit from Theosophy, because unless it is made our own, that inner explanation, the invisible aspect of the books become available to us only then. The truth cannot truly be written, but HPB, the 19th century teacher, told us that it was as close to truth as it could be written. So what is in those books is golden, and we need to dig it up for ourselves. Each human being is its own authority in this Kali Yuga, in this century, and we need to make those decisions for ourselves as to how to apply Theosophy to daily life. The United Lodge of Theosophists is guided by its declaration, and the declaration states that the policy is independent devotion to the cause of Theosophy without professing attachment to any theosophical organization. It is loyal to the great founders of the Theosophical movement and does not concern itself with dissensions or differences of individual opinion. The work it has on hand and the end it keeps in view are too absorbing and too lofty to leave it the time or inclination to take part in side issues. That work and that end is a dissemination of the fundamental principles of the philosophy of Theosophy and the exemplification in practice of those principles through a truer realization of the self and profounder conviction of universal brotherhood. It holds that the unassailable basis for union among Theosophists, wherever and however situated, is similarity of aim, purpose, and teaching, and therefore has neither constitution, bylaws, nor officers, the sole bond between its associates being that basis. And it aims to disseminate this idea among Theosophists in the furtherance of unity. It regards as Theosophists all who are engaged in the true service of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, conditional organization, and it welcomes to its association all those who are in accord with its declared purposes and who desire to fit themselves by study and otherwise to be the better able to help and teach others. The true Theosophist belongs to no cult or sect, yet belongs to each and all. The following is the form signed by the associates of the United Lodge of Theosophists. Being in sympathy with the purposes of this lodge, as set forth in its declaration, I hereby record my desire to be enrolled as an associate, it being understood that such association calls for no obligation on my part other than that which I myself determine. Today's reading is from the Dhammapada. The sage: he who has thrown off the fetters and freed himself in all ways, he is free from sorrow. For him there is no suffering. He has completed his journey. The thoughtful exert themselves. They do not delight in any abode. They leave their house and home as swans their lake. Those who have no possessions, who nourish themselves according to knowledge, and who realize the goal of freedom by perceiving that life is empty and transient, their path is hard to trace, like the flight of birds through the sky. He whose appetites are asleep, and who is indifferent to food, who has perceived the goal of freedom by realizing that life is empty and transient, his path is hard to trace, like the flight of birds through the sky. Even the gods envy him, whose senses are subdued like the horses, well tamed by the charioteer, who is free from pride and free from depravities. He who is patient on earth, firm like Indra's bolt, like a lake free from mud, for him there is no round of births and deaths. Calm in thought, calm in speech, calm in actions, he is who has obtained freedom through true knowledge. He has become tranquil. He is full of repose. The man who is not credulous, who has severed all ties, killed all desires, for whom even occasions to act with like or dislike arise not, who knows the ever-existing uncreate, he indeed is exalted among men. Delightful is the place where our hearts dwell, be it a village or a forest, be it by deep waters or by desert edge. Delightful are the forests to our heart. They charm not the worldly. There the passionless find delight, for they are not allured by sense life. And now today's talk, why study Theosophy?
Friends, welcome. Today is the topic, why study Theosophy? And I'm going to put some things on the board, and then to make it a little more interactive, I'll let you all choose which ones you want to hear about. One reason to study Theosophy is it explains the ancient source of all philosophy, of all religion, of all symbolism, and so forth. Another reason is it explains the first principles of the universe.
The markers.
And these we know as the three fundamental propositions of the philosophy of Theosophy of deity, law, and being. Third reason is that who we are as man is that we're a microcosm of the macrocosm. Another reason is it explains cycles and reincarnation. And through this perfectibility of man, perfectibility, that many eyes? It's funny, words look different when you're looking at it this way than when you're writing it on paper. Another reason is there's no such thing as dead matter, which was a common belief and still pervades. Seventh reason is that explains that our Earth is part of a chain of globes, chain of 7 globes, and where the Earth chain came from before it became the Earth. That man in the universe is composed of 7 principles, from material all the way up to spiritual. And 9, Theosophy explains psychic and laws and phenomena. So those are just some to start with.
Perfectibility of man.
Okay, perfectibility of man. Whoops.
That's almost exactly what I was going to ask for, except there's a lot of stuff there.
Yeah, there is.
It's really comprehensive, what you're saying. So why would we even get involved in this from a spiritual aspect?
Okay, we'll address that in the greater context.
Perfectibility would be.
Let's start with perfectibility of man. That's a great place to start. One of the great reasons for the study of Theosophy is that in the process of discovering ourselves, we necessarily discover that at the root of our being is a divinity, a God. The source from which flow those things in our lives which are sweet and beautiful, those thoughts and dreams of a higher life, the love which we bear to our fellows, all aspirations that encourage one to lead a different kind of life, all deeds that are helpful in character and of a truly spiritual and divine nature, all that is eternal in our being, these qualities flow from the divine part of us. But having discovered the existence of this spiritual pole of our being, we want to know how we're going to strengthen the divine and conquer the lower. That gives us a reason to study Theosophy, to find the way of life, ethics of conduct, and how we go about our daily lives, how we live, how we think, how we act. We know what we ought to do, and sometimes it's sort of vague because maybe we're brought up with some principles to guide our behavior, but maybe we're just sort of left to go along with the culture's idea of what is good. We may have heard from our childhood the golden rule, do not do unto others as you wouldn't want done to you, so to speak. But still we need something further. In the infinite gradations of consciousness, from the lowest to the very highest, and each of these sort of will pertain to each other, they're all interwoven. From the lowest consciousness we can conceive of, maybe we can conceive of a one-celled creature and it's just fluttering wherever it is. It's not self-conscious, but it's alive. Everyone can not deny that it's alive. From that all the way up to, we've heard of gods and Mahatmas and beings who are more in advance of us, or even the smartest, most intelligent human being, the one most gifted, the most genius, who expresses the flowering of humanity, whether, in music or in manner and philosophy. In these seemingly infinite gradations of beings that make up the universe, we call those men who have attained perfection adepts. And adepts are facts in nature, and they're ideals for us to emulate. And this emulation consists in studying to know oneself, but also studying them, what they have done, what they have said, if they've written anything. And as we learn more and more about the philosophy that these adepts have existed throughout time, every culture has a record of them. They go by different names, but basically their ethics are the same. People may have said they founded a religion, but very often the sage expressing some high metaphysics or ethics, it's the followers who founded a religion, not the being himself. But we should understand them and emulate them. So we want to know ourselves and to understand them. And as we learn more and more of the philosophy that these adepts gave out, is that first that they tested their information. And this comes from the ancient source, that all knowledge and having lived many lives, there's this idea of perfectibility, that we're not here for just one short life, and that adepts exist like Gautama Buddha, Christ, Krishna, and there are other examples, Lao Tse and so forth, that they tested, formulated, and preserved, and then represent to the world a coherent philosophy, and that is what Theosophy is. We find ourselves gradually growing in our knowledge and our wisdom, and despite maybe setbacks or wanderings, we find ourselves attracted to the height of, perfectibility. And certainly it is possible that from life to life we work on different facets of our nature, and eventually we perfect them. And there is in fact a process where once one determines to follow this path and brings out the best that one can, life after life, it does attract the attention of these beings. So there is a process by which one can become pledged to them, and that's called chelaship. And then through lifetimes of study, eventually one becomes and learns all the laws of nature, one can become perfected. And this ability to improve one's nature over time through reincarnation is that there's a logic to this, and it becomes fact for those who have attained it. Behind all religions, behind all philosophies, there is a record, a tradition of some great personage, and all the many saviors of different times and peoples taught the same fundamental ideas. This fact suggests that there is a body of men, of perfected men, product of past civilizations and evolution, our elder brothers, in fact, who have acquired and are the custodians of the knowledge and experience gained through eons of time. Their knowledge is actually the very science of life, for it enters into every department of existence and of nature. They know the natures and processes of the beings below man and above man. And as we know the processes, just as we know the ordinary processes of everyday life. This knowledge they have preserved and recorded, and they have a memory of it, a continuous memory, just as we have a memory of yesterday's experiences and events for us. So one could say that this record is preserved also in the highest levels of the astral light, the akasha. There is a record of all of existence. It's not like we act and it just disappears. Because of causality, every action has a reaction, and all parts are related to each other. So it is said in the Akashic light is a record, an unbroken record of all the great deeds, and there is a history there. One could also find this history in the zodiac, which are symbols preserved that tell the evolutionary path of mankind. One could find a similar record kept in maybe the trigrams of the I Ching, an ancient Chinese book on the way, the way of life and so forth. So perfectibility of man, once we realize that there are these perfected beings, we want to understand their nature, who they are, how they act, what they do, how they help. And it gives us a goal. And this goal isn't present elsewhere in the world. There are religions who postulate that we're fallen, that we're somehow broken, that we can gain or lose a soul. Whereas Theosophy says that we are a soul, and that soul is evolves and can be perfected, and that's a great reason why study Theosophy. Do you have another one?
Yeah, I mean, are you going to first cover what you are going to cover, and then we're to ask questions at the end? How are you doing this?
I'm doing it a little more interactively, just because they are all interrelated. So it seems maybe the audience can pick what they most want to hear. We could certainly do a part 2, and we'll try and tie it up at the end.
So at the end of each section, we ask questions.
Sure, whenever one occurs, or you have a comment.
Yeah. Well, what you have just explained about all religions coming from the same root, but in the previous centuries there wasn't anything written. Each human being had to go out and search for themselves as to where the truth was. But for the 19th century, HPB actually wrote it for the future generations so that we wouldn't have to oscillate not knowing where to go to find the information. So there is a tremendous difference between that movement and the ones that came before, because as you said, the sages don't themselves write anything on paper. So it was their followers that founded those religions and then anthropomorphized it and concretized it as dogma. But in this case, the books are available to us and we can read it, understand it, ask questions, and as you said, this is an internal process, so that soul growth is really internal to each human being through that process.
Yeah.
Is it not?
Madame Blavatsky, who was the expounder of the modern Theosophical movement, claims that she was a student of some adepts who resided in the East and who, because the cycles were right to change the mind of mankind because it was headed towards psychism and materialism, was right for this information to be reintroduced to humanity. And we find that it is periodically reintroduced when we look at the history of certain movements. You know, some of the Rosicrucians taught the same philosophy. The Alexandrian school in ancient Greece taught these ideas. But Madame Blavatsky is the modern expounder, and she put most of her writings in the Secret Doctrine, where we can find this information, at least as much as she said they are willing to give to humanity at this stage, because humanity as a whole has exhibited some selfish qualities, and this information is meant to purify the mind, to alter it, to give it something for the higher to grasp onto. Here first.
I was going to propose man microcosm as the next topic too.
Okay, did you want to make a comment on the previous?
A question, yeah.
Sure,
Yeah,
okay.
About out of curiosity, in I want to bring up two pretty much opposite interpretations. I have seen a lot of people have within Christianity. One is that, actually the general one is that only God is perfect. And on the basis of that, the two approaches I've seen of people take, which are opposite, is on one side some people say, because only God is perfect, it's almost a blasphemy for us to even pretend to even try to attain perfectibility. It's just out of our reach. We can only approximate that. Then there's another interpretation within Christianity too that I've heard, and is that there is a calling for humankind to strive as much as possible as we all want, as much as we can, to perfectibility. That the closer to perfection we get, the closer we are to a reunion with God, a religare, a reunion. Those are two. I'm bringing this up out of curiosity because I would like to know what's Theosophy's take on this matter and how could it be interpreted. How should we guide ourselves in life?
Can you please define God? Because
Yep.
it's important.
Yeah, that's what we'll do.
Who is God?
Right. Most religions have God, and God is a all-powerful being that rules over humanity, that takes an interest in human affairs. But in Theosophy, God is more a principle, as in deity, which is to say an impersonal principle, that it is sort of, it's symbolized as space. something that just is. You can't conceive of it not being there. And that deity is the foremost principle. And it is the source of all, it contains all, everything comes from that source, from deity. And it's in the first fundamental proposition of Theosophy. We can just say, deity is an omnipresent, eternal, boundless, and immutable principle on which all speculation is impossible, since it transcends the power of human conception and can only be dwarfed by any human expression or similitude. It's beyond the range and reach of thought. And in the words of one of the Upanishads, unthinkable and unspeakable. So this is the absolute reality that antecedes all manifested being, any periodical manifestation of the universe. It's infinite and eternal cause, we can say. So if this is the theosophical conception of deity, some of the conceptions that were brought up in Christianity shows how dwarfed and personalized it's become, and it's anthropomorphized, and it's a human tendency. Whenever in the culture we think about animals, we tend to anthropomorphize. It's a very common tendency. But in terms of first principles, in strict metaphysics, even as mathematics would apply to it, there's no anthropomorphizing. It's a principle. It's ever present, as said, immutable. So these ideas that these opposing ideas in Christianity, even we can see that they're, even after the expounder of the so-called Christian religion, Jesus, there's hundreds of sects of Christianity, each with their little difference. And it's wonderful that people can notice differences and highlight them, but no one of them has the entire truth. And that's one of the reasons to study Theosophy. The ancient source says that this philosophy can be found in all religions and sciences. There's a thread of truth in them all, and it's up to us to see those similarities, to sift through and test the information. Does it make sense in our mind? Does it make sense in action? Does it make sense in comparison? And that's one of the objects of the Theosophical movement, is to study all religions and sciences and find the similarities. So that is a profitable study, and it is one that is undertaken in Theosophy. Do you want to finish up this thread, and then we'll...
Yeah, I would like for you to comment on this idea that in all these religions that are anthropomorphic, we are held as sinful and separate from the origin of that source. This philosophy takes it back to the causeless cause and says we're one with it. If we're inherently imperfect, there is absolutely no possibility ever that we're going to reach perfection. But if we are inherently perfect, then, as you said, by following this process, we can reach to that height. That's the difference.
So what are we? Are we inherently perfect, or are we inherently imperfect?
Perfect.
We are inherently perfect.
In the spirit and soul.
Right. The highest pole, we could say, of our being, spiritual, is one with it, always is. We're just not, our consciousness is not functioning at that level of awareness yet. We've narrowed our gaze into the world of material things, and it's through karma and reincarnation and cycles, we're trying to lift ourselves out of that. We all know inherently there's some truth, but and religions make an attempt, but as was said, they often require us to admit of some fault or weakness, to pledge to do something, but when examined, they're quite unphilosophical. And we can't ignore that aspect of our nature when we take everything into consideration. HPB really well in The Secret Doctrine can show where certain traditions, say Christian tradition, where they got certain ideas, when it was changed through maybe different Christian councils, how maybe the Kabbalists had an element of truth and that was transformed into something else into Christianity. It's really kind of, just like when we study history, it's kind of a web, and she lays it out in such a way that one realizes no one could have made this up. She makes references to books that one could examine and see for oneself. She always encourages Theosophists and people to be independently minded, and that most of us kind of mentally need to force ourselves to think about it, because it's kind of a different way of thought, but once that process is begun, it opens up a lot of avenues towards information, assimilation, more questions, and that's part of the process of figuring out who we are.
In terms of the 7 principles, a few minutes ago you said that the highest pole, human's highest pole is one with the deity, and in terms of 7 principles, it's the atmic principle that's the highest. So my question is, how does the atma tie to the deity?
Oh, the atmic principle? It's said that atma is like a spark from the fire. The spark is in no way different. It's the same, but it's a spark in each and every human being, in each and every atom. There's no place where it does not exist. We all come from a source, from somewhere, and that is that source, and that is man's highest, most spiritual pole or principle. And we could list the 7 principles if that would be helpful. And then we'll go into man, the microcosm. So if we start with, Atma, spirit, and then it needs a vehicle. It can't, it is everywhere, but to manifest as a self-conscious being, it needs a vehicle, or it's called the spiritual soul, or a buddhi. And we have Sanskrit terms for these because English doesn't really have any terms for these. And then from these come manas, which is mind. This spark essentially lights up the mind. And then the vehicle for mind is the animal soul, or desire, as desire first arose in it. And then there's a life principle, of vitality or life principle, called prana. And then there's the astral body, which is the plan, the prototype for the physical body, and then the physical body, the rupa, as it's called in Sanskrit. And these have different words, like the kamic principle of desires, kama, the body of desire, kama rupa, and so forth. So this is from the top pole to the most physical, and the more one learns about them, the more it makes a lot of sense. So to move on to man is the microcosm, have some notes, and then we've kind of already touched on it, but we reflect the universe. So one of the basic ideas to be held is that man is the microcosm. As he is so, then all the hierarchies of the heavens exist within him. But in truth, there is neither macrocosm nor microcosm, but one existence. Great and small are such only as viewed by a limited consciousness. In man are the same powers and forces which are to be found everywhere in nature. He is held by the masters of wisdom to be the highest product of the whole system of evolution, and mirrors in himself every power, however wonderful or terrible, of nature, by the very fact of being such a mirror of the cosmos. So, within man are powers and principles we weren't aware of. As we expand consciousness, we become aware of higher faculties. Some of the faculties in man have not exhibited themselves naturally yet. Just as there are 7 principles, there are 7 powers and senses associated with each that allow us to perceive and on each of those 7 planes of consciousness. So HPB says that the brain is the center of where some of these principles can be awakened through the mind. And we know the mind, even science tells us, we barely use, all of it. Perhaps if one was to take one of those fMRI images of the brain of an adept, one might see that it's, using all parts of it and all centers are lit up. It's said that they, for instance, don't need to sleep because they are sort of recharging and assimilating everything on the fly. There are different books like Patanjali's Yoga Aphorisms which explain some of these powers. Clairaudience, clairvoyance, telepathy, moving objects, being able to reverse gravity. Gravity is only one pole of attraction and repulsion. Instantaneous knowing what's in the mind of whatever being one focuses on, whether it's the mind of an ant or an animal or a stone. And it explains that all the types of consciousness are mirrored within man, and that we can, once we learn that they exist, for one, and then how to, through meditation, access higher realms of consciousness, we can awaken those powers. And that's part of the information that HPB wanted to bring us, is that they will develop in the natural course of time, but because mankind has been very material and physical and anthropomorphic, it's warping, it's making the thinking principle kind of crooked, that our natural tendency should be to the higher. And she outlines lots of, evidence and facts and so forth that point us in that direction. Plus we have that innate, desire to know and to do good. Power of a unifying kind. So all these powers exist within man. We're a mirror of all the universal powers that we can identify. Truly our principles, all our vestures, our 7 principles, are truly amazing when we think of ourselves as a multi-leveled being, and that it makes sense that we're getting a grasp on all of them as we live, and we're gradually perfecting them, and that there is further work we can do once they're exercised and being used, and that we would be joining brotherhood of those who have already passed through the human stage. It just makes sense that there's consciousness below us, there's consciousness where we are, and there's consciousness above us in terms of advanced knowing itself. So those are some ideas. Does anybody have any other with microcosm?
Just a comment. It caught the student's attention when I read it. She says that her objective was not just to provide information in those books, that she teaches as nature teaches. And it becomes very apparent that she does not put similar information all together. It's scattered all over the book. And she says, through that process of discovering for ourselves, we learn to use our intuitive powers. And that for this philosophy, that is very necessary. The intuitive powers are very necessary. So then that activation process you described, is that an internal process?
Most definitely. The activation is an internal process. It's, you know, mystics have voiced it in different ways, but a linking of the head and the heart. It's a journey. It's been symbolized as a path that each one takes within oneself. As Theosophy says, each one of us becomes that path. And she's always using words that break us out of the mode we're used to thinking about ourselves. And that's why, that's how she's helping us access the intuitive, our intuitive powers, where intuition is like direct perception of truth, where we just know it. We don't have to go through proving it, although she says that's a good exercise too, and we should all, you know, use our minds to the fullest. But true intuition is direct perception. And the reason we can do that is because we have those centers that are connected to everything in the universe. We're a mirror of some part of the cosmos, and we're expressing some part of ourselves, but that's only a little part of it.
One other comment. There's a very detailed explanation about the pineal gland in the Secret Doctrine, but I think it would be very beneficial to everybody to read it.
Yeah,
because that's the spiritual center that needs to be activated.
The pineal gland, science says, is just dormant, but Theosophy says that it's one of the centers that, if awakened, would bring about spiritual sight, where the third eye would open and we would be able to see on the astral plane and on the spiritual plane as one perfects it. Mm-hmm.
You talked about the brain. Are the brain and the mind the same thing?
No, the brain and the mind are not the same thing. The brain is the physical organ that has centers that correspond to the mind. We would say that the mind is like a principle. The mind has powers, and the brain allows us in a physical body to access those, so to speak. Our bodies are instruments, and they're very finely tuned.
So that pineal gland is a link between, you might think of it, between our physical being and the mind?
Yeah, that's one way one could approach it.
Well, does that mean that we can actually use the mind and not the brain?
Can we use the mind and not the brain? Yes, when we're not in a physical body and the brain is part of the body and is dead, the mind, the top three principles, the spirit, the spiritual soul, and the mind, which the mind is dual, it tends to gravitate either towards the animal or towards the spiritual, But these three principles generally in man, she says, are the immortal individuality. And that is what we would exist in between lives in a physical body. And the mind is most certainly active. And the after-death states are broken down into detail of a, disintegration of the physical elements, assimilation of the aspiration and experience, and a carrying on of that impulse. It can't just disappear. We even know that from physics, that all energy is transformed. It doesn't just jump out of existence. So that's one of the bases for understanding reincarnation, and that these principles don't die. They're eternal, and they compose the individuality of man, that which goes from life to life to life, whereas the personality, the brain, might be peculiar to that particular life. Particular tendencies due to genetic inheritance, race, whatever, the time we're in and the circumstances we're born into.
But are you saying that we cannot control our mind in a body, because that's what the adepts do? They do have a body, but they control it. They don't allow it to interfere with the higher aspect.
Yeah, because the adepts have, as was said, they've perfected all the principles in their nature. They've perfected controlling all these vestures. They are not taken down, by passion. They're not, distracted by something. They have perfected each principle to its utmost, and they work together with the principles. They can take on a body or function without a body. They can, as in Patanjali's it was said, they can use more than one body if they want to. They can bring about, they can appear to be more of them than there are. There's all these, powers that sound like far out, but if one understands all the principles and the tools that are used, it makes perfect sense. But the Mahatmas, they may work through a body among men, or they may work from the higher planes, working to inspire and to communicate through dreams, through inspiration, and so forth. They are not impeded by not having a body.
I think it's important to state that they do this by being selfless, by being charitable, by destroying the selfish parts to expand their consciousness and be one with all.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, they do it by mastering the animal nature and being immune to it, being above it. And they do this through acting selflessly, acting on behalf of all. Because unless one, this philosophy is all based on the unity of life, and we can't ignore any part of it, whether it appears to us as good or bad or indifferent. It's all a part of us. No aspect of the one life can be affected without it affecting all the other parts. So yeah, they live selflessly. They, it's said they have their eye on humanity. We are like younger brothers, sisters that they want to help, because the purpose of deity, law, and being, of this, why we exist, incarnation, is maybe for the universe to experience itself, but we come in contact with matter from the spiritual plane. We get involved in matter, and we gradually, by our mind, we affect it, and we work with it, and we eventually help raise it up to a higher level of consciousness, so that every cycle is on an ascending arc. And that is another feature of the universe. It's sort of inherent in the plan of the universe.
So,
Go ahead.
so in order to reach perfectibility, what is one essential element that each human soul should exhibit under law?
Universality, it seems like to this student.
What about that law, morality being in the center of that law? They say that ethical behavior has to be exhibited by each human soul. In other words, they cannot help you if you personal.
If you act
Selfish.
constantly for yourself, yeah, you have to act on behalf of all others to purify one's nature, to bring it to.
So that brings in the paramitas,
Paramitas are
charity, love, and all.
virtues, transcendental virtues. Yes. Those are like, it begins with charity, which is another way of saying unity.
And she was talking about her students that were constituting, I think, her inner circle. And she said that without moral courage, that wasn't recorded. And that took my attention.
Without courage, say that again?
Moral courage.
Her students who were invited to join the inner circle in her time, if that moral courage wasn't there, their pledges were not recorded. This is her own statement. That really caught my attention. That moral code has to be your moral code too. Your heart had to be sort of aligned with the moral code of the universe.
Right, unless you're aligned with it.
Yeah, that's what it suggested to Lucifer. I don't know what else it means, but you know.
So this, law in being is that all souls are fundamentally identified with the universal oversoul. The oversoul being itself an aspect of the unknown root, and the obligatory pilgrimage for every soul, a spark of the oversoul, a spark of that unknown root. Through the cycle of incarnation in accordance with cyclic and karmic law during the whole term. So every spark, so to speak, passes through every elemental form of the phenomenal world and acquires individuality first by natural impulse, then by self-induced and self-devised efforts, ascending through all the degrees of intelligence from the lowest to the highest, from mineral to plant up to the holiest archangel. The pivotal doctrine of esoteric philosophy admits of no privileges or special gifts save those won by one's own ego through personal effort and merit through a long series of reincarnations. So this brings about, we touched on, we'll just clarify a little bit, this cycle of being from the elemental up to the very highest. What then is the universe for, and what's the final purpose of man, the immortal thinker? It is all for the experience and emancipation of the soul, for the purpose of raising the entire mass of manifested matter up to the stature, nature, and dignity of conscious godhood. The great aim is to reach self-consciousness, not through a race or a tribe or some favored nation, but by and through the perfecting, after transformation, of the whole mass of matter, as well as what we now call soul. Nothing is or is to be left out. The aim for present man and his initiation into complete knowledge, and for the other kingdoms below him, that they may be raised up gradually from stage to stage to be in time initiated also. This is evolution carried out to its highest power. It's a magnificent prospect. It makes of man a god and gives to every part of nature the possibility of being one day the same. There is strength and nobility in it, For by this no man is dwarfed or belittled. For no one is so originally sinful that he cannot rise above all sin. Treated from the materialistic position of science, evolution takes in but half of life, while the religious conception of it is a mixture of nonsense and fear. Present religions keep the element of fear and at the same time imagine that an almighty can think of no other earth but this, and has to govern this one very imperfectly. But the old theosophical view makes the universe a vast, complete, and perfect whole. And we'll add a couple more things before we close.
Can I just throw one thing out?
Oh,
I'm
sure.
looking at
Please do.
I think it was the Nag Hammadi articles discovered in 1945. I was just looking at some of that, and it looks almost exactly like the theosophical principles that were laid out in the 1880s and 90s. So religion has not always been what we see it today. It was at one time, it was a Gnostic approach. That's what was going on in like
Gnostics, yeah.
200 until it started being more prescriptive, like we see it today.
Yeah, and this philosophy leaves nothing out. Like, even things that people think are miracle or supernatural, Theosophy says these are just powers and a science, really, of nature that we don't yet understand. And when we take the whole system of evolution into account, we can see that these phenomena, you know, are really some of those centers being awakened in people. We talked a little bit about the Mahatmas, and it says the magical, so-called magical phenomena done by maybe Eastern fakirs or yogis are all performed by the use of natural forces and processes not even dreamed of as yet by the West. Levitation of the body in apparent defiance of gravity is a thing to be done with ease when the process is completely mastered. It contravenes no law. Gravitation is only half a law, the other half of the law being expressed by the word repulsion, and both being governed by the great laws of electrical force. Weight and stability depend on polarity, and when the polarity of an object is altered in respect to the earth, immediately underneath it, then that object may rise. But as mere objects are devoid of the consciousness found in man, they cannot rise without certain other aids. It speaks of levitation of the body, cohesion. The power of cohesion is a distinct power of itself and not a result as is supposed. This law and its action must be known if certain phenomena are to be brought about. For instance, HPB saw the passing of one solid iron ring through another, or a stone through a solid wall. So another force is used, which is dispersion. And so these opposites, cohesion and dispersion. Cohesion is the dominating force for the moment. The dispersing force is withdrawn. The cohesive force keeps the particles in their original position. An adept has such dynamics that he is able to disperse the atoms of an object to such a distance from each other as to render the object invisible, and then can send them along a current formed in the ether to any distance on the earth. At the desired point, the dispersing force is withdrawn, when immediately cohesion reasserts itself and the object reappears intact. It may sound like a fiction, but being known to the lodge and its disciples as an actual fact, is equally certain that science will sooner or later admit the proposition. Using the same powers the trained adept can produce before the eye, objective to the touch, material which was not visible before, and in any desired shape. And this is why the student said that our intuition, our imagination, and all those powers of the mind need to be activated. Matter is held suspended in the air about us. Every particle of matter, visible or still unprecipitated, has been through all possible forms. And what the adept does is to select any desired form, existing as they all do in the astral light, and then, by effort of the will and imagination, to clothe the form with the matter by precipitation. The object so made will fade away unless certain other processes are resorted to, which need not be described here. But if the processes are used, the object will remain permanently. There are others, like letters precipitating onto a page. And this naturally leads to the proposition that the human will is all-powerful and the imagination is the most useful faculty with a dynamic force. The imagination is the picture-making power of the human mind. In the ordinary average person, it has not enough training or force to be more than sort of dream, but it may be trained. When trained, it is the constructor in the human workshop. Arrived at that stage, it makes a matrix in the astral substance through which effects objectively will flow. It is the greatest power after will in the human assemblage of complicated instruments. So that's a little bit about imagination. Communication with another mind at a distance. The adept attunes all the molecules of the brain and all the thoughts of the mind so as to vibrate in unison with the mind to be affected. And that other mind and brain will also have to be either voluntarily thrown into the same unison or fall into it voluntarily. Such is mind communication at a distance. And there are many others. Clairvoyance, clairaudience, and second sight are related very closely. Has to do with the astral light and so forth. So no department of nature is excluded in the study of Theosophy, and that is another reason why I study Theosophy. So we'll continue with more questions and comments from students. Please join us next week, which is more about the great teachers of humanity.